Slavery was definitely a dreadful experience, and not many know the history of this terrifying slavery. These are the words of people who were once enslaved and were victims of one of the worst crimes against humanity committed in the United States. Hearing their cries of anguish and listening to their stories brings a different kind of justice to the subject than reading about it in a book ever could. John Henry Folk was a storyteller and the host of a radio show. In 1941, he initiated a project to raise awareness about racism by conducting interviews with people who had been enslaved in the past. Fountain Hughes, a former slave, was one of the people he interviewed.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, and now I am 101 years old.
Folk had no idea that this interview would turn out to be one of the most significant in his career. In spite of the fact that many slaves were kidnapped or taken captive, Hughes was not one of them. As was his father, he was born into a family of slaves. He had no experience with any other way of living. He asserted that they would sell them just like they would sell horses, cows, hogs, and other animals of a similar nature using an auction bench. According to him, they would place the animals on the bench and bid on them in the same manner that they bid on cattle, and this is just one of the weird cases in history of terrifying slavery. The slaves despised the auction bench and avoided going there at all costs. In this place, people would not only find out who their future overlords would be, but they would also discover the exact value that one person might place on another. Then, if they had any rotten ones left over, they would sell them to those who dealt in niggers. When they referred to nigger traders, what they meant was that those people would be transported to the South and sold there. As soon as they left the sale, they would be subject to the whims of whoever bought them as a slave. When a person is viewed more as an item of property than as a person, there is naturally very little that is done to ensure that they are comfortable. Slaves were typically provided with deplorable living circumstances, clothing that was torn and worn, and oftentimes only the barest essentials in terms of nutrition. When people were held as slaves, many of them did not have access to mattresses. People slept on the ground, just like a lot of other people who lived in the wild. Most of the time, the slaves were only allowed to wear the clothing that they arrived in, which was typically comprised of rags and cloth. The diet of the slaves did not receive a great deal of attention. The majority of the time, the only food they were given consisted of items like soups or stews that were created from the leftovers of their master's dinner. Slaves did not have access to weekends, holidays, or other types of time off. Work and attending to the requirements of the masters took up each and every waking hour of each day. If they want them to cut all night long in the field, they will cut. It wasn't a sense of obligation that drove the slaves, and it certainly wasn't affection for their masters and mistresses. The fact that even the tiniest infraction may result in a terrible punishment, which most of the time took the form of beatings, cast a pall of fear over them. Laura Smalley, a former slave, recalled an incident in which she witnessed another slave lady being punished with a flogging for defending herself when her master's mistress attempted to hit her, and she retaliated by shoving the mistress into a chair. In spite of the fact that slavery was a system that allowed evil to flourish unchecked, there were some owners who strove to be better and treated their slaves with more decency and decorum than was typical at the time. One of the most prized things that a slave may hope for is to have a master who will talk kindly to them, show civility towards them, and treat them as humans. Even though they would preach about being honest, the masters were not very trusting of their students. Even when following the master's directions, the most basic action of leaving the house involved a series of stages. Without a pass, which was a note from their master, they were no longer able to travel anywhere, not even to the house across the street or anybody else's home. They would be allowed to pass once again once the message was delivered successfully. Slaves were granted a form of freedom with the adoption of the Emancipation Proclamation, but this freedom was limited. They were not as really free as they believed they were. Sometimes, Union soldiers would travel through an area without giving the people they had helped free a second consideration, despite the fact that their former slaves had once thought of them as liberators. There was also a time when the Yankees arrived, seized all of the fine horses, threw all of the meat, wheat, sugar, and other supplies out into the river, and even though they were aware that the people wouldn't be left with nothing to eat, they nevertheless went ahead and did it. Slaves all over the South were extremely reluctant to change after the order was given, and this was not just because they stood to lose the labor that they were being paid for, but also because they stood to lose an entire heritage. In response to the new proclamation issued by President Lincoln, which the slave owners did not take too kindly, the slave owners purposefully kept the potentially life-changing information from their slaves. As a result, some slaves were forced to continue working on the plantations for up to 6 additional months. However, because they had no one to direct them, many of the formerly enslaved people were disappointed to find that their newly won freedom did not live up to their expectations. They were left on their own due to the fact that they had not a single money to their names, very few possessions, and very little to no education. Unfortunately, millions of freshly freed slaves were unable to support themselves and went on to become emaciated and even die of famine as a result of their condition. A survey of the published works on the subject of Southern African American slavery indicates one essential issue that has not yet been resolved. This is the challenge that the biased historian faces. It is, of course, a dilemma that is present throughout all of history, yet it is not probable that this issue will ever be resolved so long as historians continue to be split between the scientific school and the so-called subjectivist, presentist, relativist school. These schools appear to be in agreement that historians should not participate in special pleading or pamphleteering, and should instead aim to achieve the highest possible level of intellectual detachment. However, it is important to note that as far as the enslavement of Africans is concerned, we are still waiting for the first scientific and totally objective examination of the institution. This study must not be founded on any assumptions whose validity cannot be demonstrated in an exhaustive manner. And as long as historians are required to select their evidence from a vast mass of sources, and as long as they are required to attempt to organize and interpret their findings, the prospects are not very encouraging. This does not imply that every single person who has written about slavery has had the same bias, or that some writers have not been more blatantly biased than others, or that some writers have not been more skilled than others in the art of using subtle innuendo. It is without a doubt that the late Professor Phillips was the one who made the single most significant contribution to our current knowledge of slavery in the South. It is possible that the large amount of fresh source material that he discovered will prove to be his most enduring legacy. However, Phillips was also an exceptionally talented and prolific writer. Past enslaved people talk about their experiences in slavery. Click on the next video to find out these terrifying experiences.